As you may know, I've spent the last 3 years of my life inside a book, learning everything I could about Bernie Madoff and his historic fraud, which was the largest Ponzi scheme in history. I learned about Bernie Madoff's father's serial business failures at a time when the rest of America was pretty much booming in post-war prosperity. And his father's failures created a series of increasing anxieties for the Madoff family, perhaps giving rise to what I feel is Madoff's nearly pathological inability to admit failure in his own life at anything. In fact, the first time I visited him in prison, one of the 2 visits that I made to Madoff in the federal prison in Butner, I was the first journalist to ever interview him after his sentencing. I was also the second journalist to interview him after his sentencing. And then he became the chatty Cathy of the penal system and chatted with New York Magazine and Financial Times and more recently Barbara Walters. But I kind of feel like I was there first. And in that first interview, he refused to even admit that his Ponzi scheme had failed. Now he's behind bars. But no, he said. He said people still wanted to invest with him, despite the chaos in the market that we all remember from that fall after Lehman Brothers failed. He said, no, he could have kept it going. He still could have brought in money. He just got tired of the constant tap dance of raising new money and keeping it going. So he didn't fail. He quit. He simply got tired and quit. Well, I also learned about Madoff's creative reinvention of what is actually a very old crime. We call it a Ponzi scheme after Carlo Ponzi, the Italian immigrant who was so entrepreneurial in Boston in 1920, operating a fraud scheme. But the crime itself is much, much older than that. We don't even know when it was first recorded. It was called a Peter DePaul scheme before it was a Ponzi scheme, as in robbing Peter to pay Paul, which essentially defines the crime. Early investors are promised wonderful returns, which are paid for, not through any legitimate investing activity, but with money taken in from later investors, who, of course, are promised wonderful returns, which are paid for by money brought in from even subsequent investors. So it becomes a great daisy chain of passing money from one victim to another victim until there are no more new victims and the crime collapses. But Madoff put his own distinctive touch on this historic kind of crime. He used a remarkable camouflage to conceal it, and it's easy to jump to conclusions that this was so brazen and so blatant anybody must have known. Well, not exactly. Madoff had computers that generated what looked like an actual live feed from Wall Street's Central Clearinghouse. There's one scene you'll read in the book where one of his big institutional investors, a feeder fund that eventually had $7 billion invested with Madoff, came in, and Madoff invited him to the office and showed him right there on the computer screen. He said, had the stock ledger, said, pick a stock, any stock. And these were stocks the guy was supposed to own in his big hedge fund, so he said, well, AOL, picked it. Madoff turns to this computer, does a few tap dances, up comes what appears to be a Central Clearinghouse screen showing that the stocks are right there in exactly the right number. And the investor says, oh, well, okay, fine. And Madoff said, pick another stock. He says, no, it's fine. I'm fine. I'm satisfied. And he leaves. The whole screen was a fake. It had been created by a computer guy, Madoff's right-hand man, Frank DiPasquale, for exactly that purpose, to fool investors into thinking that their stocks and bonds were in a secure, independent place. He saved old letterhead stationery from his earlier iterations when he had other addresses around Manhattan, and he even kept an old Selectric typewriter. Remember those with the little bouncing ball that would bounce around? He kept one of those long after they were long forgotten so that he could create convincing backdated documents anytime an investor or a regulator needed one, so it would look legitimate. He told foreign auditors that he was trading with U.S. banks. And he told U.S. regulators he was trading with foreign banks because he knew how the world worked. And he knew that the extra trouble involved in making those cross-border checks would likely deter further investigation, particularly of a man as trusted as he was, and unfortunately he was right. I also learned firsthand about the devastating consequences of Madoff's unusual form of magnetism, and I have to say he had a gift for seduction, unlike any I've ever seen in a Ponzi schemer. And one of the side advantages of my job is I get to meet a large number of Ponzi schemers, actually many more than I hope you ever meet. And the classic Ponzi schemer is rather like Sir Alan Stanford, the Ponzi schemer who was convicted in Texas a few weeks ago of running a paltry $9 billion Ponzi scheme. You know, Madoff raised the bar for that so much with his $65 billion Ponzi scheme. But Sir Alan Stanford was the classic Hollywood casting Ponzi schemer. If you call up a casting director and say, I need a Ponzi schemer, you'll get someone who looks like him. Tall, elegant, little mustache, honestly, little David Niven mustache. The 737 that carries around him and his 3 girlfriends, the lavish arm candy, the gigantic home in Antigua, the $25 million cricket match purse that he put up to pit annually the best cricket team in England against the best cricket team of the Caribbean. A swashbuckling, bon vivant, always the loudest, biggest, most important man in the room. A man eager to persuade you that he's the smartest guy in the room. This is not Bernie Madoff. This is the anti-Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff was 180 degrees around. He wasn't the guy over in the corner who everybody wanted to buy a drink for and everyone listened to his tales. He's the quiet guy sitting over here, minding his own business and waiting for someone to approach him. And when you did approach him, he didn't try to impress you that he was the smartest guy in the room. He made you feel like you were the smartest guy in the room. I had direct experience with that gift, and I'm not sure I would have grasped it quite so clearly if I hadn't had those 2 chances to meet him in prison. The first occasion in August of 2010, I was extremely pressed for time. I had requested a minimum of 4 hours from the prison authorities. They approved me only for 2. I could hear the clock ticking in the background. I have many more questions than I'll have time for. In answering one of the questions, Madoff starts to digress a bit about an arcane investment strategy called shorting against the box. No quiz later. But I knew what it was, and I didn't want him to waste any time. You know, it's something that I didn't need, already knew, move on, right? So I gave him the little hand signals, you know, I understand that, move on. The lawyer who's sitting between us, Madoff leans over towards him and gives a little smile. And he said, oh, it's such a pleasure to talk to such a knowledgeable reporter. He continued to flatter me delicately throughout the interview, and I emerged feeling like the most professional, knowledgeable, trustworthy, credible, well-informed business reporter in the world. And I already knew he was a swindler. I already knew he was a crook and a consummate liar. Can you imagine how powerful that gift would have been when people still respected him, when they still thought he was a genius? That capacity to hold up a mirror to you and show you your very best self. So smart, so sophisticated, so savvy about your money. Why would you ever doubt your decision to trust Bernie Madoff? You're so smart. You made the decision to trust Bernie Madoff. It must be the right decision, right? It was a form of emotional jujitsu that I've never seen in any other Ponzi schemer, and I found it quite fascinating. And indeed, instead of being eager for your business, the way the classic Ponzi schemer is, you know, come on, invest with me, come on, you know, time is limited, the offer closes in 3 days, that kind of thing. No. Madoff's shtick was the velvet rope. He would maybe let you in, but maybe not. Actually, if you have too many questions, don't bother, because he's really way too busy. He only manages money as a favor to some family and friends. And if you want to be fussy and picky with all these questions and you want all this paperwork, fine. Take your money somewhere else. He's fine with that. Doesn't need it, doesn't want it. Well, of course you're not going to take your money somewhere else. Of course you're not going to pester him with too many questions when he seems so utterly and confidently indifferent to whether or not you trust him. But as different as he was from other Ponzi schemers, he shared one essential characteristic with all of them. He could make you trust him. He could make you believe in him. He could make you believe that he was, quite simply, a wizard in the ways of Wall Street. Please understand this about Ponzi schemers. They will always, always seem utterly trustworthy. No one has ever been lured into a Ponzi scheme by someone they didn't trust. Everyone who has been lured into a Ponzi scheme was lured there by someone they trusted. Am I making my point? So do not think that the Ponzi schemer on the next street, the Ponzi schemer down at the financial planner's office is going to seem shady. I mean, there's any number of crimes that a shifty-eyed guy in a cheap suit can commit. A Ponzi scheme will never, ever be one of them. Because if you can't instill trust in your victim, you can't make that person your victim. And that is why I think Ponzi schemes are so peculiarly horrific. They exploit our capacity for trust, our need for trust, to do us harm. Most other forms of white-collar crime do not. Think about bribery. Who cares? You may not trust the briber. You certainly don't trust the bribee, right? Embezzlement, maybe the person's in a trusted position, but maybe they're just the latest person to hold whatever position the money runs through. But Ponzi schemes cannot operate without trust. That's the air they breathe. But now that I've learned so much about Madoff and his crime, I find myself wondering whether we, all of us, have learned anything from Madoff and his fraud. There was a wonderful cartoon in the New Yorker last summer, maybe you saw it, that suggests to me something about where we are when it comes to the lessons of Madoff fraud. It shows a little small family in a dense jungle, and the father is standing there with his pit helmet on. He's holding the map up. And he says, okay, I admit it, we're lost. But the important thing is to remain focused on whose fault it is. Well, we've been doing that. We've been real focused on whose fault it is. Was it the regulator's fault? Was it the SEC fault? Was it Wall Street's fault? Was it Madoff's fault? Was it the victim's fault? Plenty of blame being passed around. But ascribing blame isn't going to protect us from the next Bernie Madoff. To do that, we need to see what else we can learn from the Madoff case besides who's to blame. Did we learn anything from Madoff, for example, about the limits of deregulation? In the years that an eccentric whistleblower named Harry Markopoulos was trying to educate the SEC about Madoff, the turnover rate at the SEC was so high that it was the subject of no fewer than 3 alarming GAO reports, warning that with a turnover rate this high, the agency's capacity to carry out its core mission of investor protection was at risk. Well, you're sitting in Congress, you control the SEC purse strings, what are you going to do? Well, no, you're not. You're not going to give them more money. You're not going to give them enough money to raise salaries and hold on to experienced lawyers, and you're not going to give them enough money to do the training necessary to train inexperienced lawyers. No. You're going to keep them on a short leash because deregulation was the mood of the day. In fact, it wasn't even clear that anybody wanted them to do their core mission anymore. All that red tape, all that regulation, slowing down the growth, slowing down the economy. Bad, bad, bad. Now, post-Madoff, in our wake-up call, there were new rules and substantial budget increases were promised to the SEC. Those promises have already been broken. Those rules have not been implemented. And in fact, investor protection as a topic has dropped completely out of the conversation in Washington and on Wall Street. There are some people who even say with a straight face that what we really need to do now is, wait for it, deregulate more. How's that working out? It has been amazing to me. I have not been able to watch all of the primary debates. My husband did actually watch all of the primary debates. He's recovering nicely. But I asked him to watch for any mention and discussion of investor protection. You would think somebody in the audience, some media member, a candidate with a stump speech he wants to do, would say something about investor protection. We are barely 3 years out from the worst financial disaster since 1929. The worst disaster in the lifetime of most of the people in this room. Less than 3 years old when the primary started. Not one blessed word about protecting American investors, making it safe for them to put their savings, their retirement risks in the U.S. marketplace. Now, I hope this is not going to continue into the full presidential election. I sincerely hope that citizens are going to start asking that question of both sides. What are you going to do to make investors safer? It's a complicated problem. We've relied for generations since the SEC was formed in 1933-34. We've relied on an approach known as full disclosure. Sunshine, the best disinfectant, right? Force public companies and the people who sell their shares to give you all this information about what they do, and then you can read it all and decide whether you want to take those risks. It's just one problem. We don't read it all. None of us do. If you're honest with yourself, and at least be honest with yourself, you don't read it, and I don't either. It's not written for us to read, and even if we did read it, we're not sure we would understand the kinds of risks we're getting into. So, if that's what they're relying on to keep us safer, more fine print for us to not read, I don't think that's going to get us there. We need some different ideas. We need a fresher approach, something that recognizes what investors do, which is invest as a leap of faith. Everybody invests primarily as a leap of faith. I made a leap of faith to invest with Vanguard. Other people made a leap of faith to invest with Bernie Madoff. I had a better outcome, but only because I made a smarter or wiser or luckier